The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the luxury watch store on Rodeo Drive. Inside the gleaming showroom, rows of expensive timepieces sparkled under perfect lighting. Each watch sat in its own glass case like a precious jewel, with price tags that could buy a house in most parts of the country. Behind the polished counter stood Rebecca, a woman in her early 40s who had worked in high-end retail for nearly 2 decades. She wore a crisp black blazer and had her hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Her sharp eyes were trained to spot potential customers from across the room. After 15 years of selling luxury watches, she could tell within seconds whether someone walking through those doors was a serious buyer or just another dreamer. The store was unusually quiet for a Tuesday. Only the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Beverly Hills traffic broke the silence. Rebecca adjusted the display of diamond-studded watches, making sure everything was perfectly aligned. This was her domain, and she took pride in maintaining the highest standards. The brass door chimed softly as someone entered. Rebecca looked up and immediately felt her enthusiasm drop. A man in his late 50s shuffled in, wearing faded blue jeans with holes at the knees and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days. His dark hair was messy and uncombed, sticking out from under a worn baseball cap. A scruffy beard covered most of his face, and his sneakers looked like they had walked through half of California. Rebecca watched as the man slowly made his way past the entry display. He moved with a quiet, almost shy manner that made him seem even more out of place in the expensive store. His hands were tucked deep in his pockets, and he kept his head down as he walked. This was exactly the type of visitor Rebecca had learned to manage carefully over the years. Someone who had probably seen the store from the street and wandered in out of curiosity. Maybe he was killing time while waiting for a bus. Or perhaps he was a tourist who wanted to see how the other half lived. Either way, she doubted he could afford even the cheapest item in the store. The man stopped at the first display case and peered through the glass. Rebecca could see him studying the watches with what seemed like genuine interest. He spent several minutes at each case, moving slowly from one to the next. His reflection in the glass showed a face that was focused and thoughtful, not the quick, overwhelmed glances she usually saw from window shoppers. Rebecca decided to keep her distance for now. Sometimes these situations worked themselves out, naturally. The person would realize the prices were far beyond their reach and quietly leave on their own. It saved everyone the awkward conversation about whether they were actually planning to make a purchase. But this visitor was different. Instead of being intimidated by the obvious luxury around him, he seemed completely comfortable. He studied each watch like he was reading a good book, taking his time and really looking at the details. When he reached the sports watch section, he paused for a long moment at a particular display. Rebecca felt a slight worry starting to build. The man had been in the store for almost 10 minutes now, longer than most casual browsers. He was looking at everything with the kind of attention that suggested he might actually be planning to buy something. But that seemed impossible given his appearance. She watched as he moved to the dress watch section, where the prices jumped significantly higher. These were the pieces that cost as much as luxury cars. Surely he would be discouraged by the price tags and move on. But instead he leaned in closer, studying the intricate faces and delicate hands with obvious appreciation. The man's behavior was puzzling Rebecca more by the minute. Most people who couldn't afford these watches either left quickly or asked nervous questions about prices. This visitor was doing neither. He examined each piece like he was already imagining it on his wrist. Rebecca noticed that despite his casual clothes, the man carried himself with a certain quiet confidence. His shoulders were relaxed, and he moved through the store like he belonged there. When he bent down to look at a lower display case, she caught a glimpse of his profile and felt a tiny spark of recognition. But it was too quick to place. The afternoon light was starting to change, casting longer shadows across the store floor. Rebecca realized she had been watching this mysterious customer for almost 15 minutes. Her other colleague had stepped out for a break, leaving her alone to handle whatever situation might develop. The man was now standing in front of the most expensive section of the store. This was where they kept the pieces that cost more than most people made in several years. Watches that were works of art as much as timepieces. Rebecca felt her anxiety spike as she watched him study these ultimate luxury items with the same Careful attention he had given everything else. She had seen this before, though rarely. Sometimes people who clearly couldn't afford these watches would spend a lot of time looking at them, perhaps living out some fantasy of wealth and success. Usually, they would eventually ask to try something on, and she would have to find a polite way to explain that the store had policies about handling such expensive items. But something about this man felt different from those other dreamers. There was no nervous energy about him, no fidgeting or obvious signs that he was out of his element. He studied the watches with the calm focus of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Rebecca decided it was time to make contact. She couldn't let him wander around indefinitely, especially in the high-value section. If he was a serious customer despite his appearance, she needed to help him. If he wasn't, she needed to politely guide him toward the exit. She smoothed her blazer and walked over with her most professional smile. As she got closer, she could see that the man was looking at a particular watch with intense interest. It was a stunning piece, one of the most expensive in the entire store. The price tag would make most millionaires think twice. The man seemed to sense her approach and looked up. His eyes were kind but tired, with laugh lines that suggested someone who smiled often. Up close, there was something vaguely familiar about his face, but Rebecca couldn't quite place it. He nodded politely and returned his attention to the watch display. Rebecca positioned herself next to the case, ready to begin what she expected would be a delicate conversation. She had done this hundreds of times before, finding ways to determine a customer's serious interest without being offensive. But as she prepared to speak, something about the man's intense focus on that particular expensive watch made her pause. This was either going to be a very quick conversation or a very surprising one. Rebecca cleared her throat softly as she approached the man who was still studying the expensive watch display. Her years of experience had taught her how to read people quickly, and everything about this customer screamed that he was probably just looking. Still, she had a job to do. "Good afternoon," she said with her practiced professional smile. "Is there anything specific I can help you find today?" The man looked up from the glass case and met her eyes. His voice was quiet and polite when he spoke. "Hi there. I was wondering if I could take a closer look at that Patek Philippe over there." He pointed to a stunning silver watch with a deep blue face that sat in the center of the most expensive display. Rebecca felt her stomach drop slightly. Of all the watches in the entire store, he had chosen to ask about one of the most expensive pieces they carried. The price tag on that particular watch was $87,000. She glanced at his worn clothes and scuffed sneakers, then back at the watch he was pointing to. "Oh," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "That's a very special piece. Are you familiar with Patek Philippe as a brand?" "A little bit," the man replied simply. "I've heard they make excellent watches." Rebecca nodded slowly, buying herself time to figure out how to handle this situation. She had been in similar spots before, but usually people would give her some hint about their budget or mention that they were just curious. This man seemed genuinely interested in seeing the actual watch. "Well, that particular model is quite an investment," she said carefully. "It's actually priced at $87,000. Were you thinking of something in a particular price range today?" The man didn't seem shocked or embarrassed by the price. He simply nodded and said, "Could I see it, please?" Rebecca felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Every instinct told her this was not a serious buyer, but he wasn't acting like the usual browsers either. Most people would have made some excuse and walked away by now. Instead, he stood there patiently waiting for her response. "Of course," she said finally, though her voice carried a hint of reluctance. "Let me get that for you." She walked behind the counter and unlocked the display case. The watch felt heavy and expensive in her hands as she lifted it out. She placed it carefully on a velvet display pad on top of the counter, positioning it so the man could see it clearly without being able to pick it up himself. "This is our Nautilus model," she began, launching into the sales description she had memorized. "It features a Swiss automatic movement, sapphire crystal, and is water-resistant to 120 meters. The case is stainless steel with a hand-finished brushed surface, The man leaned in to examine the watch more closely. Rebecca watched his face as he studied the intricate details of the timepiece. His eyes moved carefully over every aspect of the watch, from the distinctive octagonal bezel to the horizontal lines on the dial face. He seemed to genuinely appreciate the craftsmanship. "The movement is beautiful," he said quietly. "How many jewels does it have?" Rebecca was surprised by the technical nature of his question. Most casual browsers didn't know enough about watch movements to ask about jewel bearings. "This one has 29 jewels," she answered. "It's been carefully regulated for accuracy." "And the power reserve?" he asked, still studying the watch intently. "Approximately 45 hours," Rebecca replied automatically, though she was growing more puzzled by the minute. This man clearly knew something about watches, which made his appearance even more confusing. Maybe he was some kind of watch repair person or collector who just dressed very casually. The man nodded appreciatively. "It's really well made. The finishing on the case is incredible." Rebecca found herself in an awkward position. The customer was asking intelligent questions and seemed genuinely interested, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that this was not going to result in a sale. The disconnect between his appearance and the expensive watch was too large to ignore. "It really is a masterpiece," she agreed. "Patek Philippe has been making watches since 1839, so they definitely know what they're doing. Of course, a watch like this is quite an investment. Most of our customers who purchase pieces in this range have been planning the purchase for quite some time." She hoped this might give him an opening to explain his situation, or perhaps indicate that he was just looking for now. Instead, he surprised her again. "Could I also see that one?" he asked, pointing to another watch in the same display case. This one was even more expensive, with a price tag of $98,000. Rebecca felt her professional smile starting to feel strained. She was beginning to wonder if this man understood the prices they were dealing with. Maybe he had seen the numbers but didn't realize they were in thousands of dollars, not hundreds. "That's actually even more expensive," she said gently. "That one is $98,000. "I understand," the man said simply. "Could I take a look?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the case again. She was trained to provide good customer service, even when she had doubts about a sale. But she was also aware that her time was valuable and she had other responsibilities in the store. As she placed the second watch on the display pad, she couldn't help but glance toward the store entrance. Part of her was hoping another customer might walk in, someone who looked more like the typical clientele for watches in this price range. Someone in the expensive suit or with obvious signs of wealth. The man examined the second watch with the same careful attention he had given the first. He asked about the complications, the case thickness, and the type of strap. Each question demonstrated knowledge that surprised Rebecca, but his appearance continued to bother her. "This is really nice too," he said, after several minutes of examination. "The rose gold case gives it a completely different character." Rebecca nodded, though she was starting to feel impatient. "It's definitely one of our most popular high-end pieces. The waiting list for this model is typically 6 to 8 months. She mentioned the waiting list partly to gauge his reaction. Serious buyers usually wanted to know about availability immediately. Casual browsers often used long wait times as an excuse to leave without making any commitment. But this man just nodded thoughtfully. "That's not too bad," he said. "I've waited longer for other things." Rebecca was running out of polite ways to determine whether this was a real customer or not. She had shown him 2 extremely expensive watches, answered all his technical questions, and given him every opportunity to indicate his actual interest level. Yet he continued to act like someone who might actually make a purchase. The store felt very quiet around them. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the floor, and Rebecca could hear the soft ticking of several display clocks. She realized she had been working with this one customer for almost half an hour, longer than she usually spent with anyone who didn't end up buying something. "Is there anything else you'd like to see?" she asked, hoping he might finally give her some indication of where this was all heading. The man looked thoughtfully at the 2 expensive watches laid out before him, then turned his attention back to the display case. Rebecca watched as his eyes moved across the remaining timepieces, studying each one with the same careful attention he had shown the others. Actually, yes, he said quietly. Could I see that Vacheron Constantin over there? The one with the perpetual calendar? Rebecca's heart sank. He had just pointed to the most expensive watch in the entire display case. The price on that particular piece was $125,000. She felt a growing sense of frustration mixed with disbelief. Either this man had no understanding of money, or he was playing some kind of elaborate game with her. That's our most exclusive piece, she said, her professional smile becoming more forced. It's quite a bit more expensive than the others we've looked at. How much? The man asked simply. Rebecca hesitated. $125,000. The man nodded as if she had told him the watch cost $25 instead of a fortune. Could I take a look at it? Rebecca felt her patience starting to wear thin. She had now spent almost 45 minutes with this customer, showing him increasingly expensive watches, and he seemed completely disconnected from the reality of what these prices meant. She began to suspect he might be wasting her time on purpose. Of course, she said, though her tone was cooler now. But I should mention that this particular watch requires a significant deposit just to handle, given its value. It was a small lie, but she hoped it might finally get him to reveal his true intentions. The store didn't actually require deposits for customers to examine watches, but she needed some way to determine if this was going anywhere. The man looked at her calmly. That's fine. How much of a deposit? Rebecca hadn't expected him to agree so readily. She had made up the deposit requirement on the spot and didn't have a number ready. Well, it's usually $5,000, she said, picking what seemed like a reasonable amount to discourage him. Cash or card? The man asked. Rebecca stared at him in surprise. She had been certain that mentioning a deposit would end this strange encounter, but instead he seemed perfectly willing to pay it. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. Well, either would be fine, she managed to say. The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Rebecca watched in amazement as he opened it and began counting out crisp $100 bills. He placed 50 of them on the counter in a neat stack. There's the $5,000, he said simply. Could I see the watch now? Rebecca looked down at the money on her counter, feeling completely confused. The bills were real and there was definitely $5,000 sitting in front of her. But nothing about this situation made sense anymore. Who carried that much cash in such a casual wallet? And why would someone who could afford these watches dress like they had just finished doing yard work? With shaking hands, she unlocked the display case and carefully removed the Vacheron Constantin. It was an incredibly complex timepiece with multiple subdials showing the phases of the moon, the day of the week, and the month of the year. The craftsmanship was absolutely stunning, representing hundreds of hours of skilled work. This watch shows the complete calendar for the next 100 years without any adjustment, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. It tracks leap years automatically and displays the moon phases in real time. The man leaned in to examine the watch closely. He spent several minutes studying the various complications, asking detailed questions about how each function worked. His questions were so sophisticated that Rebecca began to wonder if he might be a watch collector or dealer himself. The finishing on the movement is incredible, he said after examining the back of the watch through its crystal caseback. You can see every component has been hand-polished. Rebecca nodded, though she was still trying to process what was happening. This man clearly understood luxury watches at an expert level, but his appearance suggested someone who might struggle to afford a basic timepiece from a department store. As they talked, she noticed her colleague David had returned from his break. He was restocking some displays near the front of the store, but she could see him glancing over occasionally. David had worked in luxury retail even longer than Rebecca, and had an excellent memory for faces. Maybe he could help her figure out what was going on with this strange customer. The man continued to examine the Vacheron Constantin with obvious appreciation. The perpetual calendar mechanism is fascinating, he said. It must take incredible skill to create something this complex. It does, Rebecca agreed. There are only a few watchmakers in the world who can assemble these movements properly. Each watch takes several months to complete. The man nodded thoughtfully. I can understand why they cost so much. The amount of human skill and time that goes into making something like this is remarkable. Rebecca felt herself relaxing slightly. At least he seemed to understand the value of what he was looking at, even if his appearance didn't match his knowledge. Maybe there was more to this customer than she had initially thought. Are you in the watch business yourself? She asked, hoping to get some insight into his background. Not really, the man said with a slight smile. I just appreciate good craftsmanship. I've always been interested in how things are made. From across the store, Rebecca noticed David trying to get her attention. He was making subtle gestures, pointing at the customer and then at himself. She wondered if he recognized the man from somewhere, though she couldn't imagine how David would know someone who dressed so casually. The man finished examining the Vacheron Constantin and looked up at Rebecca. This is really beautiful work. All three of these watches are incredible. They certainly are, Rebecca agreed, though she was still wondering where this conversation was ultimately heading. Are you thinking about making a purchase today, or are you still in the research phase? It was a direct question, and she hoped it would finally give her some clarity about his intentions. She had now shown him three of the most expensive watches in the store, accepted a $5,000 deposit, and spent nearly an hour answering his questions. Actually, the man said slowly, I think I'd like to buy all three of them. Rebecca felt her mouth fall open slightly. Had he just said he wanted to purchase all three watches? That would be a sale of over $300,000. It would be one of the largest single transactions in the store's history. All three? She repeated, wanting to make sure she had heard correctly. Yes, the man said simply. They're all beautiful pieces, and I think they would be perfect for what I have in mind. Rebecca's mind was racing. If this was a real sale, it would be incredible. But she still couldn't reconcile the man's appearance with the enormous purchase he was discussing. People who bought multiple six-figure watches usually arrived in expensive cars wearing designer clothes. They didn't walk in off the street looking like they had just finished washing dishes. David was still trying to get her attention from across the store, his gestures becoming more urgent. Whatever he was trying to tell her seemed important, but she was afraid to leave this customer alone with so much expensive merchandise on the counter. That would be quite a significant purchase, she said carefully. Would you like to discuss financing options or how you'd like to handle the payment? The man reached for his wallet again. Would cash work for the full amount? Rebecca stared at the man in complete disbelief. Had he really just asked if he could pay cash for over $300,000 worth of watches? She looked down at the $5,000 he had already placed on the counter, then back at his worn clothes and casual appearance. Cash for the full amount, she repeated slowly, hoping she had misunderstood. If that's okay with you, the man said with a gentle smile, I know it's probably unusual, but I prefer to pay for things directly when possible. Rebecca felt like she was living in some kind of strange dream. In 15 years of selling luxury watches, she had never encountered anything like this. People who could afford to spend $300,000 on watches simply didn't walk around looking like they had just finished mowing lawns. Well, that would certainly be unusual, she managed to say. Most purchases of this size involve bank transfers or certified checks. Are you sure you have that much cash available? The man nodded calmly. I'd need to make a quick phone call to have it delivered, but yes, that shouldn't be a problem. Rebecca's confusion was reaching new heights. Who had that kind of money delivered like pizza? She was beginning to wonder if this man might be involved in something illegal. Normal people didn't carry around hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Across the store, David was practically jumping up and down trying to get her attention. His gestures had become so obvious that even the mysterious customer had started to notice. The man glanced over his shoulder at David, then back at Rebecca with a slightly amused expression. I think your colleague might be trying to tell you something, the man said kindly. Rebecca looked over at David, who was now pointing frantically at his phone and then at the customer. He seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent, but she couldn't figure out what he was attempting to say. She was torn between staying with this potentially massive sale and finding out what David needed. "Excuse me for just one moment," she said to the customer. "I'll be right back." She walked quickly across the store to where David was standing. His face was flushed with excitement, and he grabbed her arm as soon as she got close enough. "Rebecca," he whispered urgently. "Do you know who that is?" "No," she whispered back, glancing over at the man who was now looking at some other displays. "Should I?" David pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It was displaying a news article with a large photo. Rebecca looked at the picture, then at their customer, then back at the photo. Her stomach dropped as recognition finally hit her. "Oh my God," she breathed. "That's Keanu Reeves," David finished for her. "The actor, from The Matrix, John Wick, all those movies. I recognized him, but it took me a while to place him because he looked so different in person." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. She looked back at the man examining their watches, seeing him with completely new eyes. Without the beard and casual clothes, and with professional lighting and makeup, he was indeed one of the most famous actors in the world. "Are you absolutely sure?" she whispered, though even as she asked, she could see the resemblance becoming more obvious now that she knew what to look for. "Positive," David said, showing her several more photos on his phone. "Look at the eyes, and the way he stands. That's definitely him." Rebecca's mind was reeling. She had been treating one of Hollywood's biggest stars like a time-wasting window shopper. She had questioned his ability to afford expensive watches, made him put down a deposit, and basically implied that he didn't belong in their store. Keanu Reeves was worth millions of dollars. He could probably buy their entire store without thinking twice about it. And she had been treating him like someone who couldn't afford a basic watch from a department store. "What should I do?" she whispered to David, feeling panic starting to set in. "Just treat him normally," David advised. "Don't make a big deal about it. Famous people usually appreciate being treated like regular customers." Rebecca took a deep breath and walked back across the store, her mind racing with embarrassment. How could she have been so blind? Now that she knew who he was, everything made perfect sense. His knowledge about watches, his calm confidence, the fact that he could casually produce $5,000 in cash. "Sorry about that," she said as she approached him. "Just a quick question from my colleague." Keanu looked up from the display case he had been examining. "No problem at all." Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat as she tried to figure out how to handle this situation. Should she acknowledge that she knew who he was? Should she apologize for her earlier behavior? Or should she just pretend nothing had changed? "So," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "you mentioned wanting to purchase all 3 watches. That would be a total of $310,000. "That sounds right," Keanu said simply. "When would be a good time to complete the transaction?" Rebecca realized that despite knowing his identity now, she was still struggling to process what was happening. Even for a wealthy celebrity, spending $300,000 on watches was a significant purchase. Most of their high-profile customers took time to consider purchases of this size. "Well, we could certainly arrange that," she said. "Would you like some time to think about it, or—" "I'm ready now if you are," Keanu said. "Like I mentioned, I just need to make a phone call to arrange the payment." Rebecca watched as he pulled out his phone and stepped a few feet away to make his call. She could only hear bits of the conversation, but it sounded like he was talking to some kind of assistant or financial manager. The call lasted only a couple of minutes. "They'll have the payment here within an hour," he said when he returned. "Is that okay?" "Of course," Rebecca said, though she still felt like she was in some kind of surreal situation. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with the watches?" Keanu smiled, and for the first time Rebecca could see the charm that had made him famous. "I'm organizing a charity auction for a children's hospital. These would be some of the featured items." Rebecca felt her heart sink even further. Not only had she treated a famous actor poorly, but he was buying these expensive watches to help sick children. She had questioned the motives and financial capability of someone who was actually trying to do something incredibly generous. "That's wonderful," she managed to say, though her voice was tight with emotion. "The hospital has been struggling to raise funds for some new equipment," Keanu continued. "Luxury watches tend to do really well at charity auctions. People like the idea of owning something special while also helping a good cause." Rebecca nodded, feeling smaller by the minute. Here was someone using his wealth to help others, and she had spent the last hour treating him like he didn't deserve to be in their store. "I think that's an amazing thing to do," she said quietly. Keanu shrugged modestly. "It's just nice to be able to help when you can." As they waited for the payment to arrive, Rebecca found herself wondering how she could possibly make up for her earlier behavior. She had learned a lesson about assumptions that she would never forget. The next hour felt like the longest of Rebecca's career. She tried to focus on organizing the paperwork for the massive sale, but her mind kept replaying every moment of her interaction with Keanu. Every dismissive comment, every skeptical look, every time she had questioned his ability to afford the watches. The weight of her behavior was crushing her. Keanu sat quietly in one of the store's leather chairs, occasionally checking his phone but mostly just waiting patiently. He didn't seem bothered by the delay, and he certainly didn't act like someone who was upset about how he had been treated. If anything, he appeared completely relaxed. David kept glancing over at Rebecca with a mixture of sympathy and amazement. He had heard enough of her earlier conversation to understand that she had made some serious mistakes in how she had handled this customer. But even he seemed impressed by how calmly Keanu was taking everything. When the courier finally arrived with a briefcase, Rebecca's hands were actually shaking. The man who delivered the money was professionally dressed and clearly accustomed to handling large cash transactions. He verified Keanu's identity, had him sign some papers, and left the briefcase on the counter. $310,000, Keanu said simply, opening the case to reveal neatly stacked bundles of cash. "Would you like to count it?" Rebecca looked at more money than she had ever seen in one place. Each bundle was marked and appeared to contain $10,000. There were clearly 31 bundles in the case, which meant the amount was exactly right. "I trust you," she said quietly, though she knew she would have to count it eventually for the store's records. As they began the process of completing the sale, Rebecca found herself struggling with whether to address what had happened earlier. Part of her wanted to apologize profusely for her behavior, but another part was afraid that bringing it up might make things worse. Keanu seemed to sense her discomfort. As she was filling out the sales forms, he looked up at her with kind eyes and said, "You know, I want you to know that I understand." "Understand what?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she knew. "You were just doing your job," Keanu said gently. "You see someone walk in dressed like I am, and you have to make quick judgments about how to spend your time. I don't take any of that personally." Rebecca felt tears starting to form in her eyes. His kindness was somehow making her feel worse about her behavior, not better. "But I was rude to you," she said. "I questioned whether you could afford these watches. I made you put down a deposit that we don't even normally require." Keanu shrugged. "You were protecting your store and being careful with expensive merchandise. That's exactly what you should do." "But I treated you like," Rebecca started to say, then stopped. "Like a regular person?" Keanu finished with a smile. "That's actually refreshing. Most of the time, people either recognize me and act weird, or they don't recognize me and treat me normally until they find out who I am. Then everything changes. You just treated me like any other customer the whole time." Rebecca was amazed by his perspective. Here was someone who could have complained to her manager, demanded an apology, or made her feel terrible about her assumptions. Instead, he was actually thanking her for treating him normally. "I still feel awful about it," she admitted. "Don't," Keanu said firmly but kindly. "Seriously, don't give it another thought." As Rebecca continued processing the sale, something unexpected happened. Keanu began asking her about other items in the store. Not expensive watches this time, but some of the more moderately priced pieces they carried. "Do you have any nice watches in the $2,000 to $3,000 range?" Wambarakami asked. "Of course," Rebecca replied, confused by the sudden change in price point. "Are you looking for something specific?" "Actually, I was thinking about the people who work at the children's hospital, Keanu explained. The doctors and nurses who will be benefiting from the auction. I thought it might be nice to get some gifts for them too. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. He was already donating over $300,000 worth of watches to charity, and now he wanted to buy additional gifts for the hospital staff? How many people are we talking about? She asked. Maybe 20 or 30, Keanu said thoughtfully. Nothing too expensive, just something nice to show appreciation for their work. Rebecca quickly calculated that even at $2,000 per watch, he was talking about spending another $60,000. This was turning into one of the largest single shopping trips in the store's history. I have some beautiful pieces that would be perfect, she said, leading him to a different section of the store. As they looked at watches suitable for gifts, Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying the experience for the first time that day. Keanu was thoughtful about each selection, asking questions about durability and practicality rather than just appearance. He wanted to make sure the gifts would actually be useful to people who worked long hours in demanding jobs. They selected a variety of sports watches and dress watches, making sure to have options that would appeal to both men and women. Keanu insisted on including a mix of styles and colors so that each recipient could choose something they personally liked. When they finished selecting the additional watches, the total purchase had grown to nearly $400,000. Rebecca had never processed a sale even remotely close to this size. There's one more thing, Keanu said as she was calculating the final total. Rebecca looked up, wondering what else he could possibly want to buy. I'd like to make sure you get credit for this entire sale, he said. I assume you work on commission? Rebecca nodded, though she was surprised he had thought about that aspect of the transaction. Good, Keanu said. You've been very helpful, and you deserve to benefit from this purchase. Rebecca felt the tears starting again. Not only was he not angry about her earlier behavior, but he was actively trying to make sure she benefited financially from the sale. The commission on a $400,000 purchase would be substantial, likely more than she usually made in several months. You don't have to do that, she said. I want to, Keanu replied simply. You spent a lot of time with me today, answered all my questions and helped me find exactly what I needed. That's worth something. As they completed the final paperwork, Rebecca realized she had learned something important about making assumptions about people. She had judged Keanu based on his appearance and nearly missed out on not only a massive sale, but also the chance to help with an incredibly generous charitable effort. Can I ask you something? She said as they finished up. Sure. How do you stay so kind when people probably judge you all the time? Keanu thought for a moment before answering. Everyone is fighting some kind of battle that you can't see, he said. I try to remember that when people react to me in different ways. We're all just doing our best with what we know. Rebecca nodded, knowing she would remember those words for the rest of her career. As Keanu left the store with arrangements for the watches to be delivered to the hospital, she realized this had been more than just a sale. It had been a lesson in kindness, humility, and the danger of judging people by their appearance. She looked at the completed sales receipt in her hands and smiled. This was definitely going to be a day she would never forget.